Welcome to the 39 ですね、セミナー of the Medical Education at the University of Tokyo 医学教育セミナー第39回になります。いつもありがとうございます。Today's lecture speaker is Professor Clarence Kreider, the third lecture ですね。3回目のシリーズの3回目 and also the last lecture by him because he has to go back to the United States soon after that. なんですが、the theme is, yes, as you can see, the assessment of clinical reasoning in medical application. 臨床診断推論の評価という内容になっています。この領域は本邦ではあまり研究者がいないんですけども、最近非常にたくさん現場のベースですね、ケースベースの、テキストブックスなんかがたくさん出版されるようになってきていますけども、これを研究ベースでやっている方がなかなかいなくて、うちの大西講師が結構この分野のことについてリサーチを進めてましたけども、今日はそれをですね、レビューということで、総括してお話しいただいて、今後もしこの分野の研究に興味のある方がおられれば、まずぜひそのフューチャーディレクションというのを参考にいただければというふうに思います。So, Claire, please start.
Thanks for the introduction. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
The title of the talk today is The Assessment of Clinical Reasoning in Medical Education, a review of the history, current approaches, and future directions. We individuals who are involved in measurement in medical education divide our task into three basic sub-areas. Clinical knowledge, which represents the knowledge that is part of medical practice. Clinical skills, which is the technical procedures, communication, and professionalism. And the third is clinical reasoning. Now, these three categories are somewhat artificial, and they overlap a lot. But still, it makes a lot of sense, I think, in terms of measurement to keep them separate, because the kinds of measurement techniques that we use to measure these three domains are really quite different. And the topic today is going to be clinical reasoning, and a large part of what we're going to be talking about is validity, okay? The logic behind what we do to assess this domain known as clinical reasoning. So a lot of this talk is going to revolve around the validity of a measure to assess this third category here. But, you might ask, well, why is it even important to have a valid and reliable measure of clinical reasoning? I think if you look at the research in medical education on clinical reasoning, it's been kind of in a rut, and I don't think it's made a lot of advances. And I think one of the problems is we don't have a really sound measure of clinical reasoning. If you look at the literature, there's lots of disagreement about what we really mean by clinical reasoning. So part of this talk is going to be about trying to clarify what we're doing when we try to assess clinical reasoning. And in fact, there's lots of instances in the sciences where the science didn't advance until they had an accurate measure. I mean, you can even look at, when they were trying to validate some of Newton's laws, Galileo, used a ramp to slow down the ball so that his crude timing measure could verify a lot of the gravity measurements. And in physics, there's a multitude of instances where there were competing theories and they awaited an accurate measure. And there's a kind of I think a very simple quote by Keith Simon that I think is very true, and I think it probably applies to psychology as well. And that quote is, by comparing accurate measurements with numerical predictions of a theory, we can gain confidence that the theory is correct. And even though this was in the field of physics, I think this is also going to apply to what you're going to see today. But as I mentioned, there's a lot of competing theories, both in general reasoning and clinical reasoning, about how the process works and how it should guide learning. But we all agree, I think, that it's a very important part of what medical education is all about. We strive as one of the most important goals to assess clinical reasoning. So therefore, it should be assessed. You have to have some sort of agreement between what's taught and what's assessed. So it's really important, I think, that we have a valid measure of clinical reasoning. There's lots of educational implications. It may be the most important competency. I mean, that's arguable, I'm sure, but anybody that looks at a list of the competencies that we hope to instill in medical education will include clinical reasoning. And our licensure tests are always making some sort of endorsement about clinical reasoning as being one of the most important aspects of a medical education. There's lots of reasons to think that if we arrive at a sound measure of clinical reasoning, it's going to foster our educational techniques. This congruence between our educational objectives and our assessments is really important in a lot of different ways. So this idea of attaining an assessment has a lot of educational implications, I think. And some of them aren't at first that apparent, but they become apparent when you start to understand the role of assessment in medical education. Lots of research implications if we could come up with a good measure of clinical reasoning. There's debate right now about whether general reasoners, people who have high general reasoning skills, also end up becoming good clinical reasoners. And lots of that is in the selection research. People are arguing about whether we should use IQ tests that are heavily loaded on the general reasoning component as a predictor of eventual clinical reasoning ability. If we had a good measure of clinical reasoning ability, we could test these hypotheses that there's some relationship between general reasoning ability and clinical reasoning ability. It would have a lot of practical impact. And I think a measure of clinical reasoning could also be really important in assessing some of our educational initiatives. Right now, there's still to this day a lot of argument about PBL versus standard curriculum. And if you look at the research, it seems like it's never been resolved. I mean, it continues to go back and forth, and I honestly think that's probably a result of not having good outcome measures. And so, we could assess some of our educational interventions, I think, if we had a sound reasoning of clinical, or a sound measure of clinical reasoning. I think probably the single most, the single biggest hurdle in this whole quest for a clinical reasoning measure has been a lack of a clear definition. And if you read the literature, there's a lot of confusion about what it is we mean when we talk about clinical reasoning. And I'm going to make the point, I think, eventually that it's not as complicated as you might think. I mean, when you think about what we're doing, a clear definition is going to go a long ways towards arriving at a valid measure. Part of the fuzzy definitions that you see out there right now is the inability even to distinguish between clinical decision-making and clinical reasoning. Now, these are complementary topics, obviously, but they're very, very different. Clinical decision-making is about what we should do, and it's heavily about evidence-based medicine and mathematical models, Bayes theory, all these things that go into trying to substantiate what the best decision should be, how to make good clinical decisions. Clinical reasoning is more about how we actually make decisions. And if you look at the strains of research here, they're really quite different, and they have surprisingly little overlap. But in fact, they both play an important role, and I'm going to try to describe the roles that they play, and they have an important relationship to the validity of what we're doing when we say we're measuring clinical reasoning. So definitions become really important when you're trying to conceptualize what you're doing in developing a clinical reasoning measure. Okay, well, there are really complex models out there, especially in the psychology literature. Fluid intelligence, crystallized intelligence, long-term memory. There's all kinds of constructs out there that are used to describe the reasoning process. And you can become overwhelmed with it quite easily. I mean, but I honestly don't think that these complex cognitive models have done much for the measurement end of things. In other words, I don't see these complex cognitive models as being really critical to the measurement of clinical reasoning. And I'd like to offer here a fairly simple definition of what I think will suffice as a behavioral definition for measurement purposes of clinical reasoning. And the definition I'd like to offer to you right now is as follows. Clinical reasoning is a cognitive activity that integrates information from a clinical encounter with an existing system of knowledge organization. Sounds pretty simple. It has a minimal amount of constructs involved. And in fact, this is, I think, you may not recognize this, but this actually is, I think, a behavioral definition of what we're trying to measure. And we'll get into this in a little bit, in a little bit more detail. So really, when you're thinking about a measure of clinical reasoning, really what you're trying to do is detect and quantify variation in the ability to think logically within the clinical domain to solve clinical problems. Now, clinical decision-making, obviously, is what's of most interest to everyone. We want to know if our doctors are making the right decision. I mean, the ultimate outcome is, are we making the correct decisions? Clearly, that is the ultimate goal, the ultimate outcome. But what I'm trying to show is that it doesn't take much of an assumption to link clinical reasoning with clinical decision-making. And what we're measuring here between clinical reasoning and clinical decision-making is really quite different. And so I suppose you could imagine a situation where someone knows what to do. They have the correct clinical reasoning processes, but they don't do it. I mean, there may be ethical shortcomings, or there could be a number of reasons why people have the clinical reasoning skills, but don't make the correct clinical decision. But by and large, I think almost everyone would agree that someone who has strong clinical reasoning skills is much more likely to make sound clinical decision making, to be a sound clinical decision maker. And I think it's really quite a small assumption to assume that our goal is to enhance clinical reasoning in order to maximize clinical decision making. And here's a figure that I think describes what's going on right now in the assessment of clinical reasoning. Currently, most of the assessments are up here. This model basically is one of the most simple models imaginable for the clinical reasoning process. It starts out with declarative knowledge, the knowledge that is important to medicine, all the factual knowledge that underpins medicine. And then that declarative knowledge has to be organized in some fashion. And that organization has to be amenable to some sort of, to incorporating patient information. So this declarative knowledge has to be organized. And the nature of that organization is really important because it has to be flexible and allow the individual to incorporate patient information with an existing knowledge base. Well, as I'm going to show as we progress, this knowledge organization, plays a key role in clinical reasoning. There's some really good research to show that the sophistication of the knowledge organization, it plays a key role in the clinical reasoning process. And as we mentioned before, clinical reasoning obviously is really important in clinical decision making. I mean, you have to know what to do in order to actually do it. So I mean, these are no-brainers. This is a pretty simple model, and I think it's beyond a whole lot of argument as to whether these basic facts are correct. But I think this is as sophisticated as you need to get when it comes to measuring clinical reasoning. And this model, we're going to return to it from time to time. Currently, if you look at what's going on, most of the clinical reasoning research is dealing with the ultimate outcome. They present students with problems, and they see if they can solve the problem. And that's supposed to be an indication of clinical reasoning. And as we're going to discover in this talk, that is really problematic for a whole bunch of reasons, and we'll get into that later. And I'm going to propose that this connection here is much more easily measured and produces much more valid measures of a student's clinical reasoning ability for reasons that will be described in more detail as we proceed. Okay, so important validity considerations. The integration of patient information into existing knowledge structures enables clinical decision-making. I think that's a fairly, not very controversial. I think that's a fairly reasonable assumption. And I think this definition should guide test development and validity research, which is the theme of this talk. But first we're going to get into a little bit of the historical background that will allow you to understand the logic behind this, this model that I showed you in the last slide. The clinical reasoning research really started in the 70s. And there were two centers, Michigan State University and McMaster, that did a lot of the seminal early research on clinical reasoning. They used qualitative methods almost exclusively. At Michigan State University, they did something known as the think aloud method, where they had physicians or students encounter a SP, and they would think aloud through the reasoning process to arrive at a diagnosis, treatment, and that sort of thing. So they had the clinician think about what they were going through in their minds and tried to document that process in order to come to some understanding about the clinical reasoning process. And McMaster did something similar. I mean, it's also a very qualitative method, but they had expert clinicians engage a real patient or an SP, and they would record the engagement, the interaction between the patient and the physician, and then later debrief the clinician and say, okay, what were you thinking now? And it would be a video, a stimulated video. And so they stopped the video and asked the clinician, what were you thinking now? Why did you ask this question? And how did you come to this determination? Well, this research, I think, kind of culminated with a very famous book by Elstein and Company called Medical Problem Solving, an Analysis of Clinical Reasoning. And I think just about every medical library that I've ever seen has a copy of this. It had an amazing impact. I mean, I don't know how many papers have referenced this, but it's in the thousands. But it had major measurement implications, and it had major cognitive implications in something known as content specificity, which to this day is still huge in the literature. People are talking about content and case specificity, and Elstein, that was his major conclusion from this qualitative research, that there was no general clinical reasoning ability. So this research that started in the 70s and is still active today, comes to the conclusion from this 1970s line of research that there is no general clinical reasoning ability. Okay, and here's the quote that I think from that book that summarizes this conclusion. The low correlation between case performance suggests that inter-individual consistency on any of the dependent variables is weak, and that scores on the variables are influenced much more by the by the structure of the problem and the individual's clinician's understanding of the problem, than by the, are influenced much more by the structure of the problem and individual clinician's understanding of its task demand than by consistency in individual problem-solving style. So they attributed most of the variation in the outcomes of the case to something to do with the case, and very little to do with the clinician or the student. Okay, and this, like I say, to this day, I still think probably 90% of medical educators believe in case specificity. It's a huge impact, and it's influenced everything in terms of research and assessment. And this is really an example where measurement has influenced theory. But as I'm going to try to make the case, however, that I think this influence has been totally incorrect. It started out, this conclusion started out because Elstein was looking at performance on cases. In other words, he'd had physicians engage a particular case, and then he would look at their performance on some measure, usually a checklist or some sort of global rating. And lo and behold, there's almost no correlation between a clinician's ability to solve a case. One case didn't predict the next case. And so, you would rank order your clinician's skills totally different between cases. And he said, well, it all depends on which case you give them. And it has nothing to do with the clinician's so-called innate ability. But then somebody pointed out to Elstein, they said, well, maybe the reliability on these measures is so poor that the correlation's attenuated. And I think most people said, yeah, that's a reasonable argument. Perhaps the measurements are so faulty that the correlation has been removed. So people then turned to generalizability theory and looked at something known as the person-by-case interaction variance. And lo and behold, that case interaction variance was quite high. But if you look at what these generalizability studies actually show, it's really, I think, very, very clear that they misinterpreted these variance components. And there's lots of, I don't want to get into the details of generalizability theory right now because it's sort of complicated, but there's like hidden facets that people didn't recognize. And sometimes it'd be a rater nested within case. And they'd say, well, the student or the physician by case interaction is high because the cases don't predict anything. But in fact, there were nested components and hidden components in these analyses. And so I really think that most of the generalizability studies that confirmed case specificity were incorrect. And one of the really colossal oversights was the occasion facet. In other words, what would happen if you gave the same case to the same physician twice? Well, you would think the performance would be fairly consistent, okay? But what if it wasn't? Well, it isn't. Jeff Norman in 1985 gave clinicians the same case twice, sometimes nested in a series. And lo and behold, the performance on the two cases, identical cases, didn't have a very high correlation. So that makes you think, well, it doesn't really have much to do with the case at all. It has more to do with the occasion. And in fact, there's a seminal study by Shevelson who has looked at, this is actually a science test where students rotate through tasks, like science tasks. And he looked at a completely cross-design and included occasion. And in fact, the person by case interaction variance was almost zero. And so, I think there's, the medical education literature hasn't been cognizant of this at all. But I think it really calls into question this very, very prominent issue in medical education called case specificity. I don't think it exists. So I think, there's some good news and bad news in all this. First, the bad news is that 40 years of research is under question because I think all the measurement evidence that was used to support case specificity is really suspect. But there's good news too, because if you remember me telling you, this performance-based assessment of clinical reasoning has a lot of problems. Very low reliability, very expensive, and I think there's really questionable validity of it. But if indeed this case specificity notion is not correct, then maybe we can replicate psychology's success in assessing general reasoning. Psychology has done a great job in assessing general reasoning, assuming that it was sort of a unidimensional construct within the individual, and actually it has huge. I mean, if you look at the way we assess general reasoning, it's highly reliable, highly valid. It predicts all kinds of things in a person's life. And the research for that is ancient. We've been doing this for years and years, and we're very good at it. And so if indeed this case specificity idea is wrong, perhaps we can replicate something like this in the medical education domain and in the clinical reasoning domain. But, of course, there's some differences between general reasoning and clinical reasoning. General reasoning is very context-free. I mean, if you look at the tests that we use to assess general reasoning ability, they make a strong effort to remove all kinds of presupposed knowledge. They try to make everything abstract and to remove any kind of educational criteria or assumptions about pre-existing knowledge structures. And so that's very different than clinical reasoning, which is very context-bound. I mean, it's all about medicine, and it has all kinds of knowledge involved with it. I mean, we assume that there's a certain amount of knowledge that the student has to have in order to be a clinical reasoner. And in fact, this difference is one of the things that I think has to be critical in designing a clinical reasoning measure. Any clinical reasoning measure that we design has to be population specific with assumptions related to educational level. So in other words, let's suppose you're trying to assess fourth-year medical students' clinical reasoning ability. You wouldn't want to give them information, or you wouldn't want to include a test that had knowledge that was kind of rarely known. You'd want to make sure that the knowledge that was included in that clinical reasoning test was generally part of the common, most students would have that knowledge. And so, perhaps you could do something like assume like a second-year level of clinical knowledge by the time you're in the fourth year. But regardless, clinical reasoning tests will have to be very population-specific. Okay, well, before we go further about what's going on in the clinical reasoning literature, we should look at some other things that have happened in the research domain as well. In the 80s, there was a considerable amount of fascination with a famous study by Simon and Chase that looked at chess masters' ability to remember positions on a chessboard. And I mean, they could just look at a chessboard for a second and come up with almost a perfect memory of it. And a lot of that was, psychologists started to think, well, the reason for that is because it has so much meaning to them. They have been studying chess positions, and each position has some sort of inherent meaning, and it's full of structure and interrelated ideas. And so they thought, well, perhaps memory could be some sort of proxy for expertise. And medicine kind of jumped on the wagon late, I mean, in the 80s, and they said, well, maybe we could use memory for a case as a proxy for expertise. And there were people who tried to develop tests that would more or less reflect a clinician's ability to remember a case, thinking that people who had a lot of expertise would have the structure of knowledge that would allow them to recall a case. Well, those largely failed. I don't know of anyone who succeeded in testing memory as a proxy for clinical expertise. But what they did do is they started to think more about the structure of knowledge. How does the structure of knowledge impact expertise and reasoning? And so medicine started to borrow certain research traditions from psychology. The idea of scripts, that's huge in psychology, turned into something known as illness scripts in medicine. Exemplars. That's another thing that comes from psychology. Using classical cases to solve a problem and having elaborated knowledge about a case. So the research has come about in the 90s and the 2000s here really has keyed on cognitive psychology's notion about knowledge structure and how important it is in expertise and in reasoning in many domains. I think two papers that are really good background on this is one by Schmidt and the other by Bordage, who deal with notions of illness scripts and exemplars and elaborated knowledge. That seems to be now where most of the clinical reasoning research in medicine is headed. Okay, well, the lessons from this research really, I think, are fairly simple. It appears that experts display higher levels of knowledge organization than non-experts. They have a lot more interrelationships between concepts. But they also discovered that this organization is idiosyncratic. There's very little commonality between two experts. They both have complex knowledge representation structures, but they don't represent the knowledge in an identical fashion. So it's fairly unique. Each expert has a fairly unique knowledge structure. So that also implies, I think, that if you're trying to assess knowledge structure, you're not going to be able to assess just one unique knowledge structure. There's not going to be a gold standard. One knowledge structure isn't necessarily better than another structure. And so this is going to be important, I think, in our validity model when we think about how to assess this knowledge structure. And this gets back here to our model again. If indeed knowledge structure is an important component of clinical reasoning, well, then it may make sense to assess this area rather than what we're doing now, which is really assessing the ultimate outcome. And so I think current research shows that this knowledge organization plays a really key role in reasoning ability. And so again, I think this model might make some sense in a validity sense. Well, it's clear that this research has influenced the assessments, and that the assessments also have influenced the research. I mean, if you look at these early case specificity studies, that was measurements influencing theory. And I think they influenced it incorrectly, but clearly there's an interplay between the research and the assessment effort. But I honestly think that we need to step back and not put the cart before the horse, because we really need to first obtain a valid measure of clinical reasoning before we can advance theory. Because without those valid measures, it's going to be hard to validate any sort of clinical reasoning theory. So the bottom line is, I think we need sound methodologies and sound measures as a prerequisite for advancing clinical reasoning research. Well, it seemed fairly common sense to, okay, you want to test somebody's clinical reasoning ability. Let's see how well they do it in a simulated case. I mean, I can understand why people thought that might be a good idea, and in fact, that's what we did. I mean, in the 70s, we started simulating right and left. There were at one point 20 different kinds of patient management problems. These are paper and pencil exams that are sequential, where an examinee will request some information, and the information will become available, and then they'll request another piece of information, maybe order a test. But it's all sequential and it's all simulation-based. None of this information becomes available until the examinee orders it. These patient management problems became really popular in the 70s. The literature was just full of them. There were even some used in certification exams. The student would go through, collect the history, conduct a physical examination, do an investigation, come up with a diagnosis, and then come up with a treatment. Sounds logical. Sounds like a way that most people would say that's a reasonable way to assess clinical reasoning. But it relied on a couple of hinging points here. One, the data was collected sequentially, and there was some sort of notion as a pathway through the case. In other words, there was an optimal way to solve these cases. So how do you decide what's the optimal way? Well, the first thing they did is they gave it to a bunch of experts. And they said, okay, you solve these cases. We'll see what happens. Well, it turned out the experts didn't agree. And it became apparent pretty early on that there was no optimal pathway. So there was low consensus. So how do you score these things? Okay, well, they came up with all kinds of methods. One was an expert panel where they looked at the percentage of experts that selected a certain treatment or asked a certain question. All this was in response to some sort of vignette or some sort of simulated patient encounter. But the scoring methods all reduced to some sort of measure of thoroughness. And they were totally unrelated to whether or not the student or the doctor got the right diagnosis. And in fact, almost every one of these scores had an inverse relationship with expertise. The highly expert physicians got lower scores than the intermediate physicians. And so it was just it was a rat's nest. I mean, you couldn't come up with anything that was worth you couldn't come up with any measure that you could say assess clinical reasoning. And then, of course, you had that terrible problem that we talked about before. There was almost no correlation between cases. So it had zero reliability, not zero, but it was very, very low reliability. So, you know, despite all the enthusiasm and despite what seemed like a good idea, it was a total failure. And I think even today, you know, you see, we have a lot of sophisticated simulations out in the market right now. Our National Board of Medical Examiners has a multi-million-dollar case simulation that's delivered on the computer. Very sophisticated branching techniques. The scoring methods are incredibly complex. They use hundreds of experts, and they use some sort of regression methods to systematically weight the scores. They get terrible results too. I mean, they have a half day of testing and get a reliability of about 0.6. You know, I mean, all these lessons that we learned on the patient management problems from the 60s or from the 70s, I think still apply to the methods that we're trying to use today in terms of performance-based assessment, including SPs and the clinical case simulations via computer. Now, I'm not saying necessarily that SPs are a bad idea, but I think SPs can be used to assess clinical reasoning. I mean, there's lots of good things to do with an SP, you know, professionalism, communication, and that sort of thing. But the notion that an SP case can assess clinical reasoning with the checklist, I think, is very suspect. But I'm not necessarily saying that all SP use of all SPs is necessarily wrong. But I don't think you should be using it to assess clinical reasoning. Okay, so the scores then we found have almost no relationship to expertise. So for a multitude of reasons, simulation data that is designed to summarize history, diagnosis, information gathering, and treatment are unlikely to yield a valid measure of clinical reasoning. And that's why when I showed you this model before, I wanted to stress that perhaps there's another point of measurement here that makes more sense. And so we're at a point now that we have some competing measures. I think, you know, people who believe in case specificity will still say problem-based assessment of clinical reasoning makes sense. You just have to give them hundreds of cases so that you get some sort of feeling for how well they solve cases, okay? Because there's nothing really, there's no unidimensional construct called clinical reasoning. And so you have to just use hundreds of cases before you can get some notion of overall how do they do. Okay, and so if you still believe in case specificity, well then, you know, these performance-based approaches to assessing clinical reasoning would still make sense. But if you rejected this case specificity argument, well then we have some other contenders here that I think may be useful in the assessment of clinical reasoning. I imagine a number of people are familiar with the key feature problem. George Bordage was a visiting professor here some years ago, and he's one of the key movers and shakers on the key feature item, and I think it has some promise. And it basically, I think, gets at a knowledge organization construct fairly well, but we'll get into that in more detail. And then there's something known as a script concordance test. Huge literature on that, hundreds of studies. It seems to be the fashion of the day for non-performance-based clinical reasoning assessments. And then there's something known as path diagrams, which are concept maps. I don't know how many people are familiar with that. And we'll talk a little bit about that too. And there's also something known as case vignettes, which are used in the United States on our national board exam. And I'm going to make the case that even a case vignette with a multiple choice item can be considered a simulation of sorts, but it's a very structured simulation, and in fact, I think under the right conditions can measure clinical reasoning, but we'll get into the specifics of that too. And we also have some hybrid simulations that are highly structured and get away from the branching notion and the scoring of pathways and that sort of thing that I think may have some hope of measuring this clinical reasoning construct. Okay, well, one of the first item I want to discuss a little bit is the key feature item. That usually starts with the vignette, and there's usually a short selective response or a write-in response. But the main virtue of these is that they try to assess just one component that is critically important in solving a case. And so they sort of help the item writers come up with an understanding of what's the most important thing to measure within a clinical case. The Canadian boards use these on their licensure exam. They found them to be very, very, very efficient. They're fairly easy to write. And one of the things I've noticed that if you look at these things closely, they can really be rewritten as a multiple choice item with a vignette. There's nothing earth-shakingly new about this item, except for the fact that it allows you to easily construct an item that would address higher order cognitive skills. In fact, there's a study by Fisher where they incorporated some key feature items on a multiple choice exam and looked at the correlation. And if you correct that correlation, it turned out to be about 0.8. So the relationship between a key feature item and a multiple choice item is fairly high. And so, they're not necessarily brand new, and they're not necessarily assessing something that you can't assess with a multiple choice item, but they do have a format that I think is readily adaptable to assessing higher order thinking skills. And one of the things that's just overwhelmed the literature lately is the script concordance item. It's a fascinating item, and I'd really like to spend some time thinking about this here. Here's what a script concordance item looks like. An examinee is presented with a short vignette. Then they're asked, they say, okay, suppose you're thinking of this certain hypothesis. Okay, so this is your hypothesis at this point after reading the vignette. Okay, then they give you a piece of updating information. And then they say, well, how does this affect your initial assessment of the hypothesis? Okay? And so it gets at some sort of probabilistic reasoning within the examinee. These items have been tested by multiple centers. They have great reliability. Here's an example of one of the sexually transmitted diseases. And you can see, I mean, in just maybe 5 minutes, you can test 5 questions related to this vignette and various hypotheses related to the vignette. It's a pretty enticing format. But there's some problems, okay? First, let's kind of list the characteristics of an item like that. But if you look at the literature, all these people say there's no correct answer. In other words, they have this construct they call reasoning in the context of uncertainty, and therefore there's no correct answer. And this is going to cause some problems, and I'm going to explain what kind of problems that causes in a minute. But I think you would agree, it seems to assess the meaning of knowledge embedded in a clinical problem. I mean, if you look at this item, you really, it gives you some updating information, it's embedded in this clinical problem, and it changes your thinking about a particular hypothesis. It seems to get at this embedded knowledge notion. And I tell you, they're very easy to write. You can whip these items off. I've seen clinicians sit down and write 10 of these items in an hour. Whereas if you're trying to write a higher order multiple choice item, you're going to spend an hour writing one. The formats of these are really easy to write items, I think, okay? But they require an expert panel. Because the people who have conceived of this item believe there's no correct answer, they give these items to experts. And they say the scoring will be based on the proportion of experts that make that response. And their construct is something known as reasoning scripts, okay, which kind of gets into this idea of embedded knowledge. They're really high on reliability and really high on validity. And I think they ask an important question related to probability. However, there are some real philosophical problems with the item. First, this idea of no correct answer. I've never seen a definition for an educational achievement item that doesn't have as one of the criteria, it has to have a correct answer. I mean, I've never, I can't imagine getting an educational achievement test without a correct answer. We actually did a study about 5 years ago in nephrology. These items are great for nephrology because they're just, nephrology is like incredibly interrelated concepts that, work well with these items. We constructed one of these tests and gave it to, I think it was like 50 nephrology residents. And in fact, we did correct answer scoring. In other words, we sat the experts down, had them take the test, and then we asked them to convene and said, okay, there's some disagreement here, what's going on? And after we sat them down, we came up to a consensus almost every time. Sometimes it was the result of misinterpreting scale meaning. Sometimes it was just the experts don't always know the correct answer. I mean, if you look at our national board, when we convene experts to create items and to review items, I mean, there's 1 out of 3 items is fatally flawed because the experts can't agree. It's a very common problem that you get items that one person says, well, yeah, this is the correct answer, but another expert will disagree. There'll be some sort of consensus meeting, and they can't come up with a solution. But we were able to come up with complete consensus on the items that we used. We got rid of the scale, and we came up with it's either more probable, less probable, and made no difference. And we ended up with the exact same reliability as using these no correct answer notions. So I think this philosophical problem about having no correct answer may be something that we can remediate. In fact, I just published a commentary about the script concordance item, and I think if you look at what it's asking, okay, it starts out with a vignette. Then it suggests a hypothesis. Now, although the item doesn't ask the examinee to come up with a probability, at that point they have to, because ultimately they're asked to assess how it changes their probability. So they get a vignette, they come up with a hypothesis, they're given a hypothesis, they're implicitly asked about the probability of that hypothesis, and then they're given some updated information. And then they have to recalculate their probabilities based on this updated information. And then finally, they're asked about how does this updated information change your conceptions of the probabilities? So they're really asking the examinee to subtract probability 2 from probability 1. Now, this notion that they have about uncertainty, I would agree, this problem here can be rephrased in a Bayesian type of framework. And while I agree that the absolute probability of a particular diagnosis may be uncertain, the direction of impact on the piece of information they're giving to the student it better have an answer, it better have an impact one way or another, or we really have no business asking them the question. I mean, so, this idea of no correct answer, I think is just poorly conceived. I mean, in the Bayesian framework, this is the probability of the diagnosis given some test result. This usually is fairly uncertain, I would agree. But the probability, the uncertainty really comes from the initial probability of the diagnosis from the vignette, and not from how this updating information affects that probability. So if you rephrase this question to ask the examinee about how this updating information impacts the probability of the suggested hypothesis, I think number one, you can come up with a correct answer, and number two, you're really getting at some sort of meaningful understanding about how knowledge is, or how facts within a complex case impact the probability of a diagnosis. So I don't think all is lost, but with the script concordance item, but you have to get rid of most of what embodies a script concordance item. You have to get rid of the idea of scripts. I mean, I think the construct of scripts is really not very tenable. And I also think you have to get rid of concordance, so you end up with just a test, because the scoring is not really concordance at all. It's basically you have a correct answer. So, but with those changes, I mean, you see the script concordance test right now having great reliability, great validity, has a low correlation with a lot of other knowledge-based tests, which implies that it may be measuring something different. But they have to think through what exactly they're asking with this test. And I think it actually shows a lot of promise. Okay, there's other techniques out there that have been offered as a way to assess clinical reasoning. One is highly structured simulation. And when you highly structure a simulation, of course, you give up fidelity. And one of the problems with this branching notion, when a high fidelity simulation, is that if you mess up early in the simulation, it's going to sabotage your performance later on. And so, you may only get one good point of measurement in a simulation. If they mess up the first phase of the simulation, they'll never recuperate. So there's a lot of dependence within simulations that are high fidelity. So, we wondered whether if we could remove some of that dependence between phases in a simulation, whether we could get some better measurement characteristics. And we applied for a National Library of Medicine grant to develop something known as lab caps, which is incredibly highly structured. I'm going to demonstrate it in a little bit here. And so people who are really enticed with high fidelity and realism will think, well, this isn't a simulation at all. It's a test. It's not a simulation. But I think we need to think about why realism is needed in a simulation. And I'm not so sure that we've done that very well conceptually. So we've sacrificed a lot of so-called fidelity and realism in order to maximize our measurement potential. Here's the way our simulations are currently based. We have a simple written scenario or vignette. Then we ask the student or the physician to rank order or prioritize diagnostic hypotheses from a list. And so right away you can probably say, well, that's something you could measure, right? You would think that there are probably certain reasonable differential diagnoses that you should entertain, and some that are unreasonable. This is something that I think you can get experts to agree upon, that if somebody comes in with a certain chief complaint, you should be entertaining certain hypotheses. And in fact, that's what we do here in the first phase of the simulation. We ask them to rank order from a pre-existing list certain hypotheses that might be appropriate for this particular clinical scenario. But what we do next is really quite different from what you see in other simulations. We give them feedback. We say, well, here's what you did, but here's what you should have done, based on consensus of experts. So if they start out with the wrong hypotheses, it's not going to sabotage, it's not going to ruin their performance in ordering diagnostic tests or coming to a final diagnosis, because they're given, at this point, after they finish this, they're given the correct answer. Then based on the correct answer from phase one, they're asked to order diagnostic tests. And again, this is incredibly structured. I mean, this is a checklist type of format. But it just so happens that this format is identical to how pathologists order tests in the United States on a computer. So the loss of fidelity really doesn't matter, because this is actually the very format in which people order tests in reality. It's a checklist-based, computer-based test ordering design. So, again, you know, I agree that this lacks a lot of fidelity. It's not the way medicine is practiced in the real world, but this lack of fidelity, I think it dramatically enhances the measurement precision of our instrument. So, and in phase 2, we asked the examinee to order a diagnostic test. And we checked that. There's 315 tests that are available for the examinee to order. And we checked that against an expert's recommendation for what they should have ordered. And again, we can score this. In other words, how many tests did they order in common with the experts? And then we also give them feedback. We tell them what they should have ordered. Okay, so again, we have another independent point of measurement. And doing poorly in phase 1 is not going to hurt phase 2, so you don't end up with a dependence in the measurement, which is a huge deal in measurement literature. They're in phase 3 now. They actually have to finalize their diagnosis. So based on the tests that they should have ordered and the differentials that they should have had originally, they're asked to give the correct diagnosis given the results of the test. And then again, they're given feedback on what the correct diagnosis was, and then they're asked to finalize treatment. Well, despite this being a scenario, being a simulation, we ended up getting fairly reasonable reliabilities from this, and I think you can argue that this may not be a measurement of clinical reasoning, but I think it comes close. And, you know, so I think, you know, my pessimism about simulations in general come mostly from the way they're applied right now and our subscription to high fidelity and branching types of designs. And so I think, you know, with an adequate amount of structure and objective scoring, we may be able to get a clinical reasoning measure within a simulation. Other competing measures in clinical reasoning out there right now are path diagrams and concept maps. That's the notion where you're checking the structure of knowledge in an expert or a student. You ask them to diagram how certain concepts are interrelated, drawing nodes and arrows and that sort of thing. And as you can imagine, that gets really messy really fast. Usually it requires raters, some sort of expert to look at the concept map and say, well, this looks like a really reasonable way to structure the knowledge. But again, if you remember, we talked about knowledge structures being idiosyncratic. There is no correct knowledge structure for a lot of clinical problems. And so that weighed heavily against this idea of using path diagrams. But there have been some interesting developments, too, in this regard. There have been something known as objectively scored concept maps, where an examinee might get maybe these elements in the path diagram, and then are asked to fill in some of these empty nodes. And these might be from a list on the side of the computer screen. This can be objectively scored, and at this point, I think they're so new that no one's come up with a lot of good validity evidence or a lot of reliability evidence, but it's something, I think, that gives us the notion of the structure of knowledge. And if you can structure these adequately, may be scoreable and overcome some of these other problems that we've seen with the other formats. And the tried and true is still, I think, the multiple choice exam. And if you look at our National Board of Medical Examiners uses a multiple choice exam with complex vignettes. Here's like an example. They're incredibly difficult to write. I mean, these items take hours and hours to write. They require three things. They require just a profound knowledge of the content area. They require an understanding of the student's understanding. You know, how an examinee enters into this and how an examinee interprets this is a really important component. You can be an expert in this content area and not succeed in writing these items. And you also, the third thing that you really have to have is an understanding of how to write items, a test writing ability. You can be an excellent teacher and a clinical expert, know the topic inside and out, and also understand the students inside and out. But if you don't know how to write an item, you can fail too. And so this is the notion. It's more of an art than a science. And I'd say 90% of the people that try to write these sorts of items fail. You think you have a great item, but you try testing it out, and it's an incredibly difficult process. But these are very labor intensive. But in fact, I think they are really one of the tried and true methods if you're willing to put the efforts into it. They get great reliabilities, but again, they require master item writers. So I don't want to to throw away multiple choice as a potential method for assessing clinical reasoning. Okay, well, here's I'm going to try to walk through some logical steps that I think are important in understanding my validity argument in assessing clinical reasoning. The primary goal of the test or the primary goal of medical education is to provide the student a command of substantive knowledge. And logic tells us the ability to retain and express this knowledge is verbally mediated and is the basis of clinical reasoning. Now, this verbal knowledge can be communicated and stored in a written format. So, why I think we should question right away why we have to use nonverbal formats in the form of performance-based assessment to assess clinical reasoning. I think, we have a fairly strong validity argument that clinical reasoning is embodied in verbal knowledge. Now, verbal knowledge can be manipulated in the process of clinical reasoning. Can this be tested? I think it can. If you come up to me and you say, well, not all clinical reasoning can be verbally expressed, and I'll say, well, for example, what can't be expressed? And then you tell me what it is. Well, you just told me verbally what I'm missing, and I can add that to my list of verbal knowledge or verbal. So, I can't think of any reason that we need to resort to a performance-based assessment method. I think verbally mediated knowledge measures are likely to solve our task demands. So that's why I'm really intrigued by formats like the strict concordance test that get at propositions and relationships between concepts and the ability to integrate patient information into existing structures. I think it shows a lot of promise, and it's something that can be assessed verbally. And so my main point is I think we need to reassess our performance-based notions that are currently used in clinical reasoning. And here's some references, and I'll quit boring you now. If anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to entertain them.